Right. Well, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to have you here. Thank you for joining us today in this launch for the report of Indigenous peoples and just energy transition. So today we have a couple of great people here with us, and I'm gonna start by sharing our first speaker, who will give us a general overview and the opening remarks of today's webinar. And well, before I do that, excuse me, I'm gonna share with you guys the instructions on the interpretation feature, because we do have interpretation with us. So you will see the globe at the bottom, and it looks like a little planet icon. It's called interpretation. And if you select it, you can choose the language you prefer to listen to. So we have Spanish and French interpretation available. So please go ahead and set the interpretation on your end so you can be fully engaged in today's session. So having shared that, I want to introduce Mr. Dean Cooper from the World Wildlife Fund. He is aiming for a faster and greener, fairer global transformation to 100 nature safe energy based on renewables. So that includes fossil fuel phase out, energy efficiency, energy access, and just energy transitions. During his energy career of over 30 years prior to the World Wildlife Fund, Dean was a program manager for the National UK Energy Agency, among other positions. So, Mr. Dean, go ahead.
Thanks very much. Now, I'd like to say on behalf of AJET, that's the Alliance for a Just Energy Transformation, I'd like to welcome everybody to the launch of this report, as you said, on Indigenous peoples and just energy transition. So I'm the global energy lead at WWF, and I'd first like to say thanks to everybody joining us today. It's great to know that there's some real interest in the perspective of Indigenous people, which plays a key part in any just energy transition. Fortunately, I think that most people, or at least those without any personal or political agendas, now realize that the world needs to shift very quickly from fossil fuels to renewable energy. But there's still some debate over how we can do this, with those involved in energy transitions around the world often focused on specific issues and the numbers that measure the reduced supply and consumption of fossil fuels or the rate of rollout of renewables. Now, WWF certainly recognizes and supports the urgent need for such an energy transition. As you've heard, our ultimate goal, our global goal for energy is for 100% renewables. But we also realize the need to see the bigger picture, and that means 100% renewables, but faster, greener, and fairer. So, for example, when I say greener, we need to be sure that the rapid rollout of renewables doesn't cause unnecessary damage to nature. We have to realize that although renewables are far preferable to fossil fuels in terms of their impact on the climate and on nature, we must still manage the process carefully. Otherwise, we're in danger of trading an energy crisis for a nature crisis caused by the loss of biodiversity. Now, to be faster and fairer, we need to bring everyone with us. We can only achieve a lasting energy transition quickly if this process takes account of everyone's interests. So, for example, there'll always be resistance to fossil fuel phase out unless the people involved with the production, the supply of coal, of oil, of gas, if they can see the future benefits associated with the shift to renewables for their jobs, their livelihoods, their income. Now, Indigenous peoples are one group that often seem to be overlooked in these processes. So for a lasting switch from fossil fuels to renewables, we need to make those involved with the policies, the implementation, the financing, the broad issues about the energy transition, all of those aspects, anywhere around the world, we need to make them more aware of the rights, the knowledge, and the perspectives of the indigenous peoples that are going to be affected. And this shouldn't be seen as an obligation, but rather an opportunity to introduce renewables more quickly and more effectively. For example, including indigenous groups in the planning processes for renewables rollout, that can help to avoid longer term negative consequences that only people with extensive local knowledge can foresee. So this can certainly bring economic benefit as well as the critical ethical values. But most importantly, we know that historically indigenous peoples have often been disproportionately affected by such a fundamental change. Now, if this is again the case, the global energy transformation that we all need risks creating further resentment and increased inequality, and that can't lead to a sustainable future. Instead, we can engage with indigenous communities from the outset of any change, and we work together in partnership to achieve results that bring benefits to all and respect cultural priorities, to motivate full buy-in and support from all of the people directly affected. So this is one of the aims of the report that we're launching today, to raise awareness amongst all involved with the renewable energy implementation that the world urgently requires, to make sure that the values of indigenous peoples are respected. So the outcomes from the switch to renewables will be welcomed and not resented. The reality is that indigenous peoples must be included in this fundamental energy shift. It's not only fair, but also essential for the lasting success that we all need. So the fact that you've joined us for this launch today suggests that you already realize this issue must be addressed more directly. So thanks again for being here. And I hope the report will help you to convince many others of the need to engage indigenous peoples as partners in the energy transition process. Please also check out the work of the Alliance for a Just Energy Transformation, AJET, which has helped with the report, and let us know if you're interested to be part of any future work on JET-related issues. So with that, let me pass over to the main author of the report, it's my colleague from our Spanish office, Sergio Bonati. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Dean, for the opening remarks. Before Sergio shares more about the report, I wanted to introduce him to the audience. So Sergio Bonati is the Climate and Energy Officer at the World Wildlife Fund in Spain. And over the past 4 years, Sergio has worked within WWF Spain's Climate and Energy team, leading projects and advocacy efforts on renewable energy and a just energy transition. Sergio?
Thank you very much, Maria. Thank you, Dinos, for your opening remarks. I will now share my screen for my presentation. Please let me know if you cannot see it.
It's there, yes, visible.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Maria. And I would like also to start my presentation by thanking every person that has contributed to this report during its development with their valuable experience and insight, as well as to every speaker that will presenting today, and all the persons that have joined the call. It's my pleasure to present this work. I'm going to just briefly present some of the key messages and highlights of the report. You can already find the full report in AJET's webpage, as well as in WWF's webpage. So without further ado, let's get into it. So when we started developing this report, we thought it was important to highlight and to recognize that there is more than just one climate change reality, and we wanted to make this idea a central message of the report. The idea that there is no single and universal experience of climate change, but rather a plurality of realities. So typically, climate change has been defined under a global narrative that describes one planet, one climate system, and one crisis, and this has often led to one-size-fits-all approaches, often shaped by a particular view that do not necessarily match every local context. But it is important to understand that for many indigenous peoples and many indigenous communities, the perceptions and manifestations of climate change may be different. These may be seen as a disruption with the web of life that sustains their lives, or it can be as a disruption with spiritual and ancestral relationships. So it can take really many forms, and these differences can happen between communities, but even they can also be appreciated within communities. And therefore, given this diversity of perceptions and realities of climate change, we also think that the responses to climate change must be plural and grounded in the specific worldviews and ontologies and priorities of each community, taking into consideration also the internal dynamics that happen in each community. We believe that this understanding of the local context and this local adaptation is a way to at least try to ensure that climate and energy policies are just, are effective, and are sustainable in the long term. So the report then aims to also identify and understand the different challenges and opportunities that the energy transition can bring to indigenous communities. And in terms of impacts, what we've seen is that indigenous territories often overlap with regions of high ecological value. And although indigenous peoples account for 5% of global population, they effectively manage 1/4 of Earth's land surface, and they have done so for millennia very effectively. And these territories, as well as being of high ecological value, they are also of high economical value, and this has attracted a lot of private interest in the past and still. And this interest is being manifested in these territories that are affected in many environmental conflicts worldwide. And most of these conflicts are mainly caused by mining exploitation and fossil fuel exploitation and extraction projects, other mining projects, and big infrastructure development projects as dam constructions. An additional pressure to these that are already existing in indigenous territories due to their value is the urgent and rapid rollout of the clean energy transition, which places an additional pressure, as I was saying, on indigenous lands. This pressure can typically come from two different ways. One is infrastructure development, so that can be through renewable energy projects or grid expansion. And very especially what we've seen in the report is that there is mounting pressure from mineral extraction, critical minerals that are needed for the energy transition. And what we've been able to also analyze and bring up to our report is that there's currently a huge geographical overlap between the critical mineral reserves that are needed for the energy transition and indigenous territories, which of course creates pressure for these communities. But also what we've seen, also studying several case studies and other reports, is that the clean energy transition can also bring benefits and opportunities to indigenous communities, especially when when policies and projects are implemented in ways that are inclusive and respectful and consider indigenous peoples as rights holders and not mere stakeholders. So what we've seen during our analysis and the development of the report is that self-managed energy systems and co-owned renewable energy projects typically reduce dependence on expensive fossil fuels, increase energy access, foster higher revenues and more governance capacity, as well as other social, environmental, and cultural benefits for indigenous communities. Another important point is that what we've observed is that when indigenous communities and indigenous peoples are meaningfully integrated into energy planning, we all benefit from a better biodiversity conservation. This is because ecosystem health and water quality lie at the heart of land management for indigenous communities, and and therefore this is important to take into account to ensure that their views and their knowledge are taken into consideration in energy planning and energy implementation, as it is not only these communities who will benefit from this, but it's the whole world and the rest of us who will benefit of their ancestral knowledge on conservation of ecosystems. So then the report explores some case studies, some positive and some challenging case studies that also try to guide on what may work and what not to ensure just energy transitions in indigenous contexts. We are just presenting very briefly a couple of case studies here. There are more case studies represented in the report. So on the one hand, one positive case study that we've brought up is the solar grandmothers in Madagascar. This is a project that was also WWF helped launch, where effectively local women from rural communities with typically little or no formal education are being trained as solar engineers, and they are then returning to their villages as leaders, electrifying their communities with clean and decentralized solar systems, benefiting all the communities. This initiative has been so positive and so effective that it is now being replicated in many other places in Africa and other parts of the world. On the other hand, we also have the Arctic, home to the Saami people, amongst other communities, which is facing mounting pressure from different dynamics. So reindeer herding lies at the heart of the Sami people, and this traditional practice is being more and more threatened by, as I was saying, different dynamics, accelerating climate change, new mining projects, and now also renewable energy projects such as wind projects. Reindeer migration routes are being affected because of these mounting pressures, and therefore this traditional activity from which the Saami depend on is being disrupted, and this highlights the consequences of the lack of integration of indigenous communities in energy planning and energy policies. So the report then aims to propose a way forward based on the analysis that we've done to try and ensure a just energy transition in indigenous contexts. A way forward that we've summarized in these key recommendations. So on the one hand, we believe it's really important that, as we were saying at the beginning, indigenous worldviews and ways of life are respecting, and that every energy policy is adapted to the specific cultural, social, and environmental contexts of these communities, while also considering the internal dynamics that may also be different within each community. Secondly, it is important to uphold indigenous rights and sovereignty, and ensure that the free, prior, and informed consent principle is respected. Indigenous leadership and capacities must be supported to ensure meaningful influence in decision making, and as I was saying before, also making sure that we're integrating the ancestral knowledge that these communities have for nature conservation, and to develop nature positive solutions while also tackling climate change. And last but not least, also engaging early and meaningfully with the indigenous peoples, as Dean was saying, not as a formal requirement or as a cost, but as a foundation for long-term success, and making sure that they are decision makers in the process, they are rights holders and not mere stakeholders. Finally, with the development of this report, we intended to create a foundation or a basis for the future work that the Alliance for a Just Energy Transformation would like to carry out supporting Indigenous peoples. We hope that this serves as a good foundation and as a good basis, and we propose to keep working on this line and supporting Indigenous peoples through strategic communication, targeted advocacy, fostering new partnerships, building capacity both for Indigenous stakeholders and non-Indigenous stakeholders, and promoting pilot and demonstration projects to showcase how Indigenous-led renewable energy initiatives can be positive, as I was saying earlier, not only for Indigenous communities, but also for the rest of the world. So that's it from my side. I thank you all so very much once again for attending this call. And the report is now available at AJET's and WWF's webpage. Please feel free to get in contact directly with myself or with the Alliance for a Just Energy Transformation if you would like to expand on the report, or you would like any other further information, or if you would be interested in engaging with this initiative moving forward. Thank you so much, and back to you, Maria.
Thank you so much, Sergio, for sharing the report. And now we will go and listen to Ms. Minnie Degawan, who's going to be speaking about Indigenous rights in the context of energy transition. Minnie is the managing director of the FSC Indigenous Foundation with over 30 years of experience advancing Indigenous people's rights and inclusive conservation. She has worked with organizations including WWF, Conservation International, and Rewild to strengthen Indigenous partnerships, influence global policy, and support forest and climate initiatives. Let's go over to Minnie.
Good morning, and thank you very much, Maria. First, I would just like to introduce very briefly what is the Forest Stewardship Council Indigenous Foundation. This is an Indigenous peoples-led group that works to strengthen sustainable forest management and to elevate traditional knowledge as well as Indigenous forest management systems within the certification processes. So we are a global organization that is based in Panama. Secondly, today is International Human Rights Day. And what better way to commemorate it than to discuss the continuing challenges that Indigenous peoples face with regards to their basic human rights. Indigenous peoples, like all human beings, have the right to life, liberty, food, shelter, and all the basic human rights. You would think that it is but natural for Indigenous peoples then to be celebrating today because it is Human Rights Day. But unfortunately, as in many cases and in many parts of the world, there are protests that are going on. I just finished a meeting with the Philippines that are also facing very many challenges. They are being criminalized. Some of them are in hiding because they are being hunted by the military simply because they are defending their lands and territories. What makes Indigenous peoples distinct is that we have the collective rights as distinct peoples to self-determination, and this is grounded on our right to land. Without our lands and territories, without our rights to this, then we cease to be distinct, and which is why Indigenous peoples continue and will continue to defend land. And I wanted to begin by quoting from a song which I was hoping I could play, but I cannot. That land, from it springs life, from it springs our identity, our cultures, and our consciousness. Land is where we come from, where we prospered, where we struggled, and ultimately where we will rest. Land is life, land is identity. As the report has said, it is also the curse of Indigenous peoples that they have protected these lands to the extent that these days they are very much in demand because of the resources that are contained in these lands that we call home. In the generations that Indigenous peoples have occupied our territories, and we have continued to steward these lands, there was nowhere in our minds that we will be rewarded in terms of carbon, biodiversity credits, or even payments for environmental services. The only reward that we sought was the assurance that our children and their children will have a viable territory to pass on to their children. Our actions have been and will always be guided by our responsibility to past and future generations. Unfortunately, because of the work that our peoples have done and continue to do in safeguarding resources, we are now faced with even bigger threats than even before. Our people are not unfamiliar with the repeated refrain of "for national development" or "for the greater good." We have been asked to sacrifice our lands and territories before for these reasons: greater good, national development. How many dams have been built to provide electricity for cities, all at the expense of upland communities who had to see their fields, their sacred grounds inundated? How many of our mountains were flattened so that minerals can be mined to fuel the industrialization of countries? How many forests have been deforested to allow for agricultural plantations to feed the insatiable greed of developed countries for produce such as steak, avocados, and whatnot? After the COVID pandemic, Indigenous communities reported an increase in so-called development projects in our territories. Again, our communities were being asked to sacrifice in the name of rebuilding economies. More mining and logging concessions were being approved without due regard to safeguards. Existing regulatory frameworks were bypassed in favor of fast-tracking operations to allow for economic recovery. And as if this were not enough, here comes another threat, one that is even more insidious, pretending to be for the benefit of humanity, all of humanity, but in reality will bring in more hardships for our people. We are asked to allow our sacred sites to be mined for minerals to fuel the so-called green economy. The push to move away from fossil fuels is, of course, a good move, but not if it means the destruction of communities, the killing of Indigenous peoples upon whose lands these resources are located in. I remember in my town in the Philippines, 10 or 15 years ago, a developer wanted to build windmills so that he could sell green electricity to the national grid. It was not even for local use. And because it is renewable energy, the developer would have had incentives. Never mind if it means that the path of migratory birds would be disturbed, or that the community did not understand the project and would therefore not give their consent. This was a lost opportunity in terms of building something renewable, in something that would have served as a pilot project. This was a lost opportunity in educating communities or for developing renewable energy sources for that community. But because of the arrogance of the developer that thought that, Indigenous peoples do not understand climate change, do not understand renewable energy, that he could just go and build his windmills. Of course, the community did not want it, and it did not happen. In Indonesia, nickel mining is on the rise, and with it, more communities are losing their lands and also their sources of water. The same is happening in many other parts of the globe. Indigenous peoples, despite contributing least to the climate crisis, are in fact holding the line in protecting the forests, which serve humanity as a whole, as the last line of defense, but we are again being displaced. There is great irony here. On the one hand, declaration after declaration, there is recognition of the important role that Indigenous peoples play in addressing climate change. In Belém, during COP30, there were even pledges of channeling funding to Indigenous peoples. And yet, on the other hand, there is renewed vigor that is so necessary. There is renewed vigor in mining the minerals located deep in our territories to provide the alternative energy that is so necessary for developing countries to maintain their economic programs. There seems to be a disconnect on what is being said on paper about respecting Indigenous people's rights and providing resources for their self-determined actions and what is actually being done. It seems for many governments, it is enough to have declarations at the global level recognizing Indigenous people's rights. They forget that for Indigenous peoples, our rights begin and end with our rights to lands and territories. As the song I quoted before says, land is life. From it, we derive our identities and cultures. Take away the land, and we are no longer distinct peoples. Which is why this call for just transition is an important call for us. We support the call for transitioning away from fossil fuels, as we know this has caused the greatest impact on our climate. But there can be no just transition if in exchange, an entire group of distinct peoples lose their lives and their identities. The report has outlined some top-level requisites for Indigenous peoples to be fully involved in the just transition process. And I just wanted to highlight two particular items. One, free prior informed consent. I fear that this is becoming just a slogan. We are losing the essence of what free prior informed consent is. We have to understand that free prior informed consent is rooted in the recognition that Indigenous peoples own the lands, and therefore they have the right to give or withhold consent. It is not a one-time process, but it is an ongoing relationship building. Developers would come with a checklist and they would say, 1, 2, 3, we had meetings, 1, 2, 3, we have FPIC. FPIC is an iterative process and includes capacity building for both parties, for Indigenous peoples to understand what the developer is proposing and for the developer to understand Indigenous people's processes. It includes, and this is very important, it includes the right to say no. And if communities have reached that decision to say no, developers must accept it and respect it and not go back 2 months after and go through another round of checklist process. So again, I want to emphasize that ethic is not simply a slogan that developers say, we have done this or not done this. It is a relationship building exercise that is rooted in respecting the fact that Indigenous peoples own the land. Secondly, strengthening the abilities of Indigenous peoples to develop their own self-determined pathways for energy transitions. We have seen in the report that there are already ongoing initiatives, and there are many ongoing in Asia. There are projects to build micro dams, and this needs to be supported. Indigenous peoples must not continue to be seen as beneficiaries or for developers to continue thinking that they have the solution. Come to our communities, work with our communities. As the report says, including Indigenous peoples in the process should not be seen as an added burden, nor an added cost, or because the law says that we have to consult them. We have to shift the narrative and see that including Indigenous peoples in all the processes will ensure the sustainability of projects and will really make sure that we are in the right path for a future that includes everybody. So I congratulate WWF and the AJET for coming up with this report. I hope that this report is widely distributed not just to civil society, but more importantly to policymakers, so that they will understand when we say Indigenous people should be part of the just transition process, and we have something to contribute. So thank you very much, and I hope that we can continue to work together. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Minnie, for sharing these powerful insights. So we will move along to listen to Whitner Chase, who is the Senior Manager at Seneca Environmental. We'll be talking about tribal energy, sovereignty, challenges, and successes. Whitner leads Seneca Environmental's renewable energy certificate aggregation business line. He works to bring tribally owned RECs to market for voluntary purchases by corporate and government entities. Whitner began his career assisting land conservation efforts on private and public lands around the world, operating primarily as a grant maker at the Wise Foundation. Over to you, Whitner.
Thank you, Maria. And Sergio, feel free to share my slides whenever you're ready. We're seeing not quite presenter view at this point. I'm also happy to share. Okay, great.
It's ready.
Well, thank you. I'm Whitner Chase from Seneca Environmental. I myself am not Indigenous, but rather an ally. My company was featured in the report. So pleased to be here today to share a little bit more about our story. And the perspectives I share in this presentation are very high level and entirely my own. They do not necessarily represent the views of Seneca Environmental, the Seneca Nation, or any other Indigenous people. But today I'll be providing the following information: an overview first on the company I work for and its ownership structure, a cautionary tale and some success stories regarding Native American involvement in previous energy transitions, and success stories of Native American involvement in this current energy transition we're in. But before I talk about Seneca Environmental, I need to first tell you about who I really work for. Next slide, please, Sergio. The Seneca Nation is a federally recognized Native American nation. Even though the nation exists entirely within the United States, and its members are also recognized as natural-born U.S. citizens, the Seneca Nation is recognized as a sovereign state. The Seneca people have lived in the state of New York, in the United States, for over 1,000 years, and have notably played key roles in the formation of the United States in more recent times. For example, the Iroquois Confederacy, of which the Seneca Nation was a part, served as a model for the American founding fathers during the drafting of the U.S. Constitution. Additionally, Seneca women have always been political leaders, so it's no accident that the United States women's suffrage movement began in Seneca Falls, New York, where non-Native women were inspired by the political power that their female Seneca neighbors carried. As sovereign states, the Seneca Nation and other recognized tribes provide government services to their members. But due to the darkest aspects of colonization, there aren't as many Native American people as there used to be. As a result, it is infeasible for Native nations, also called tribes, to raise revenues for government services through taxation. To solve this issue, tribes often operate nationalized corporations and use profits from those businesses to fund their government operations. These companies seek to provide long-term stable financial returns to the nations, and ideally are operated in a way that reinforces the nation's traditional values. Next slide, please. Seneca Environmental, whom I work for, is one such example of this. We are wholly owned by the Seneca Nation, and we were created to help manifest the Seneca Nation's environmental ethic in the business world. We currently specialize in advising organizations in climate change planning, whether it's a for-profit company looking to reduce their carbon footprint, or a tribal government working to advance its energy sovereignty. I personally manage the company's renewable energy certificate sales business, as referenced earlier. The term in Europe, I know that there are some Europeans on this call. It's a little different. So in Europe, renewable energy certificates are called guarantees of origin. Next slide, Sergio. So first, let's couch Native American involvement in the current energy transition in a little bit of history. During the transition from coal to oil, the Osage Nation became known the world over. The Osage were forcibly removed from their ancestral lands in the U.S. state of Kansas, south to the state of Oklahoma, where they successfully negotiated a sovereign land base and ownership of the mineral rights under that land. Now, this was before oil had become an important fuel source. So when oil was discovered underneath Osage land in 1894, nobody could dispute their claim to that source of energy wealth. Between 1916 and 1939, the Osage were paid about $100 million in lease and royalty payments for the extraction of oil underneath their land. That's about 2.3 billion US dollars in today's terms. However, greedy European Americans worked to wrest that wealth away from the Osage. Deceit, theft, and even organized murder was rampant. Through no fault of their own, the Osage were not able to preserve this wealth through to the present day. This is certainly not an example of a fair and just energy transition. You can learn more about this case in a nonfiction book titled Killers of the Flower Moon. And Martin Scorsese, a famous director, also recently directed a critically acclaimed film starring Leonardo DiCaprio by the same name, Killers of the Flower Moon. Next slide, please. In the transition from oil to fossil gas, or natural gas as many people call it, the Southern Ute tribe in the state of Colorado is an excellent example of success in a just energy transition, mostly due to their efforts in more recent years. The Southern Ute began leasing fossil gas extraction rights on their land in 1949, and it was later determined that the royalty payments negotiated with gas companies were far below the market rate despite a high-quality product. In 1974, the Tribal Council, which is the governing council of the Southern Ute tribe, imposed a leasing moratorium and worked to form an organization of tribes across the United States with significant energy resources so that they could work together to increase their negotiating power with gas production companies. This was a huge risk for the tribe because gas prices in that time had gone sky high due to supply concerns in the Middle East. That was kind of known as like the 1970s global energy crisis. But forgoing short-term revenue for a better long-term outcome paid off. The tribe was able to better oversee and negotiate lease and royalty payments and ultimately built enough wealth to start their own gas production company, which has now grown into a multi-billion-dollar vertically integrated energy empire. Everyone on this call likely knows how important it is to have a good credit score if you want to take out a loan for any reason. The Southern Ute tribe was the first tribe to receive a AAA credit rating. This was reaffirmed by Fitch this year. So that's just another example of how this is a true energy transition success story. The Southern Ute were able to build wealth on their own with their own energy resources and carry that into the present day, and use that wealth to maintain their cultural and traditional practice of their traditional values. Next slide, please. So moving now to the current energy transition, no tribe has yet been able to recreate the same scale of wealth building opportunities described in the last two cases. This transition is still ongoing, but many are moving forward in a positive way. The Moapa tribe, for example, has leased some of their territory near Las Vegas to solar energy companies. You can see here in the photos, hundreds of megawatts have been developed that provide Moapa with lease revenue, jobs, and better control over their nation's energy supply. Next slide, please. In the state of Alaska, the Cook Inlet Region, Inc., which is an Alaska Native-owned corporation, built and operates a 17.6 megawatt wind project on land they own off the coast of Anchorage, Alaska's largest city. These turbines power 7,000 homes in Anchorage every year and save Alaskans money on their electricity bills by offering price stability through a fixed rate as the primary fuel source that Alaskans use to power and heat their homes. This year, fossil gas wells in the Cook Inlet began to run dry, which means that costs will increase as the local electric utility begins to pay outside firms to import fossil or natural gas. This may create an opportunity for an expansion of Fire Island wind, which could triple in size given the right economic conditions. And SIRI is constantly evaluating this to decide what makes the best economic sense for them. Next slide. Another great example of success is closer to home for us at a company called Seneca Energy. Seneca Energy is the Seneca Nation's electric utility. It's also owned by the Seneca Nation, and it's our sister company. Seneca Energy manages fossil gas distribution, renewable energy projects, and broadband internet services for residents and businesses on the Seneca Nation. Next slide. Seneca Energy has an impressive track record starting in 2014 when they plugged and abandoned 30 fossil gas wells on Seneca Nation lands. And then in 2017, they built 2 renewable energy projects. The first was a 1.5 megawatt wind turbine. You can see the photo here in the slide. And the second was a 2 megawatt solar array, also shown here. Together, these projects lower community members' electricity costs by $25 per month per person compared to the previous state. Seneca Energy also implements energy efficiency projects and has installed high-speed internet on its territory. They've also begun installing solar panels on the roofs of homes of Seneca Nation members. We're so proud of the work that they do. Next slide, please. In addition to these 3 examples of success in the current energy transition, I see more and more inspiring cases every day in my work with renewable energy certificates. Our specialty is in identifying tribally owned renewable energy projects that have not yet brought their renewable energy certificates, or RECs, to market. And we facilitate sales of those RECs to corporations that purchase them to achieve their climate goals. So next slide, please, Sergio. If you have any questions about the content I just shared or about how to purchase renewable energy certificates from tribally owned projects, feel free to reach out via the contact information on this slide. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Whitner, for sharing all of this. Now we will go with Bryan Bixcul, who is the global coordinator at SIRGE Coalition. He will talk about the key COP30 outcomes in the just energy transition. Bryan comes to SIRGE Coalition after serving for 3 years at Cultural Survival, where he served as executive assistant and coordinator and advocacy coordinator. Bryan has experience advocating for Indigenous people's rights in the CBD and UNFCCC. He serves in the Indigenous Advisory Group to the Banks and Biodiversity Initiative. Bryan, over to you.
Thank you very much, Maria. And thank you so much for the invitation to participate in this very important webinar. I appreciate the organizers for the invitation. That is a greeting in my indigenous language. I'm Maya Tsutuhil. That's the name of my peoples from the highlands of Guatemala. And I serve as the global coordinator for the SIRGE Coalition, and had the immense, awesome opportunity to watch up close Indigenous diplomacy, Indigenous power in the negotiations of the COP30, which of course bring lots of opportunities for us, but also challenges. And it was a historic moment in many ways because of the challenges that we face worldwide. Not just indigenous peoples, but everyone, all societies are. The climate crisis will impact all of us, but indigenous peoples are on the front lines, and hence the importance of sharing about the challenges that we are facing, but at the same time, the indigenous power and the movement that is happening across the globe to move governments and corporations and multilateral organizations to make advances in respecting and promoting the rights of indigenous peoples, and making sure that our collective demands are at the forefront of discussions around the globe. So that's what happened at COP30, and I will be more than happy to go into detail. But before I do that, I also want to pay my gratitude to the indigenous movement, to indigenous peoples who were engaged in the negotiations at COP30, and who are engaging also in several spaces to bring about the changes that we seek. Because for as long as there is a community around the world that is being threatened, that their rights are being violated, over the expansion of extraction of minerals for the transition, or the expansion of infrastructure for energy without their free, prior, and informed consent, then there is a battle for us to fight. And we are fighting hard, and indigenous peoples are being actors, not only victims of of the challenges that we face. So I have a presentation for today, and I would just quickly like to share with you that SIRGE Coalition stands for Securing Indigenous Peoples' Rights in the Green Economy. We are a coalition of 5 member organizations, which includes Voices, Earthworks, Batani Foundation, Tallgrass Institute, Cultural Survival, and an affiliate member, which is International Work Group for Indigenous Affairs, or IFGIA. We are a platform of a coalition of indigenous leaders, indigenous-led and allied organizations, and we are a platform for indigenous peoples to exercise the rights to self-determination and a free, prior, and informed consent. Our mission is to elevate the voices of indigenous peoples, indigenous communities around the globe who are on the front lines of the energy transition, including mining for the energy transition, including infrastructure for energy and renewable energy infrastructure and more. So that's what we do in a nutshell. And if you would like to learn more about the work of the SIRGE Coalition, you can visit our website. And why is this work important? And I would like to drill down specifically on the issue of minerals, right? Because the renewable energy expansion doesn't exist on its own. There is a choke point, and the choke point is availability of minerals. There's lots of minerals needed for the energy transition. There was a report from the World Bank and later by UNEP and on Resource Outlook that says that there is about a need of about 3 billion tons of so-called critical minerals, or what we call transition minerals, for this future, this envisioned future of renewable energy. So what does that mean for indigenous peoples? If 3 billion tons is a lot of minerals. I don't think we can envision what that number actually looks like in reality. But if you put the mass of all people on the planet today and you multiply that by 2, then that's about more or less how much minerals is needed according to those projections. But where those minerals are coming from, it's important to also understand. 54% of those minerals are currently located on or near indigenous peoples' lands. And at the same time, we have to understand that these lands overlap with huge concentrations of biodiversity, at least 40% of intact forest, at least 40% of key biodiversity areas. So what does that mean for biodiversity at the same time? And so if we look at the specifically in the United States, for example, there's an estimated that 97% of nickel, 89% of copper, 79% of lithium, and 68% of cobalt reserves and resources are located within 35 miles of Native American reservations. So this is important because it's already having huge implications for indigenous peoples' lands, for biodiversity, and for our rights. Many of these projects proceed without indigenous peoples' free, prior, and informed consent. And so it is not just about inclusion of indigenous peoples in projects related to the energy transition. It's about decision-making of indigenous peoples. That's why it is so important that we keep talking about these issues in these spaces, because it is not only inclusion what we're looking for. We are decision makers too, and we have rights, and those rights should be upheld in all of these processes. So specifically talking about the COP30 results and what happened at the COP30. I want to quickly describe that, we were, myself and a group of indigenous peoples were focused on the negotiations on the United Arab Emirates Just Transition Work Program. Of course, there are a lot more, many more negotiation tracks, but I will talk specifically about this one because that's the one that's more interesting for us today. So this program is basically anchored in Article 2 of the Paris Agreement. And the Just Transition Work Program basically says it's the interpretation of how to implement Article 2 of the Paris Agreement. And that's why it is important for us, because Article 2 specifically talks about how do we keep emissions low to allow for a future where we don't go over 1.5 degrees, although experts say we've gone over, and we're trying to still keep it low. So how does that work? And of course, we're going to transition away from fossil fuels, or at least that's the narrative that we also hear. But we also have to scrutinize the narrative of the energy transition. Are we really witnessing an energy transition? Or is what we are living through right now more accurately described as an energy addition? Because more fossil fuels are being extracted, burned to produce energy, and we are just watching that renewable energy, so-called clean energy, is being added to the grid so that more energy is available. So there is an energy addition, an expansion of the consumption of energy. And so that's why for indigenous peoples, we are scrutinizing the narrative. We are making sure that our issues are front and centered for the energy transition. So hence the need to actually talk about the Just Transition Work Program. It is a formal mechanism which will chart a path of how countries transition away from fossil fuel produced energy to renewable energy, but not just about energy, but this also talks about agriculture, about industrial processes, and so on. So what are some of the main outcomes of COP30? And I want the document is long, but I will focus today on paragraph 12I and paragraph 18 of this new document, especially because paragraph 12I and paragraph 18 now function as some of the strongest language ever adopted under the Just Transition Work Program. It recognizes the need to obtain free, prior, and informed consent from Indigenous peoples, and to ensure that all just transition pathways, this is important, all just transition pathways respect and promote the internationally recognized collective and individual rights of Indigenous peoples, including our right to self-determination. Our right to free, prior, and informed consent flows from that right to self-determination. And in a first ever reference in the UNFCCC system, this is the first time that the rights and protections needed for Indigenous peoples in voluntary isolation and initial contact, this is the first time that they were referenced, right? Because the right to free, prior, and informed consent is not enough to protect Indigenous peoples in voluntary isolation and initial contact. There are many more tools and principles needed to protect the rights of Indigenous peoples in voluntary isolation, because free, prior, and informed consent presupposes contact. And so that's why it was so important for the movement that the rights of Indigenous peoples in voluntary isolation were recognized explicitly in the Just Transition Work Program. And that's exactly what happened. And we were so fortunate that there were countries like Panama who supported greatly the movement and stood with us in the negotiations, defending the language that we proposed for countries to adopt here. The movement is also directly responsible that paragraph 18 now references the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. So it's not just about governments' responsibilities with Indigenous to promote and respect the rights of Indigenous peoples, but also the responsibilities of business. They have a responsibility to respect Indigenous peoples' rights. And they cannot over-rely on the laws that countries have. Even in countries where Indigenous peoples are not recognized, because there are many countries where we are not recognized as Indigenous peoples, business still have a responsibility to respect Indigenous peoples' rights. Sorry, Maria. Go ahead.
No, yeah, no. Oh, sorry. I had read a comment that they wanted to read, as this has a very small type of lettering. Can you share the presentation in presenter mode, please? Sorry, I also
Oh my
didn't
goodness,
cut
I've been
that.
presenting in.
I didn't cut that,
All
but it's
right.
fine. I think we're good. Thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. And so I'm almost done. But why this is important? There is a report from Brazil, for example, that says that critical minerals are currently surrounding 45 Indigenous peoples in voluntary isolation and initial contact. So this is why it is so important. There are about 188 groups of Indigenous peoples in the Amazon, and maybe a dozen more in Papua, and in Indonesia, in India. Free, prior, and informed consent is important for the Indigenous peoples that live around the territories of Indigenous peoples in voluntary isolation. But free, prior, and informed consent is not enough to protect our rights. We also need to establish no-go zones. That is what the best available practices, what the best available science says that we can use to protect Indigenous peoples in voluntary isolation, to establish no-go zones. And so we need to demand banks, we need to demand mining from mining companies, we need to demand that governments establish no-go zones in accordance now with the language adopted at the COP30 on the Just Transition Work Program, which recognizes the need, the specific needs and instruments to protect the rights of indigenous peoples. And there's already jurisprudence. The Inter-American Court of Human Rights has had decisions on how to protect indigenous peoples' rights indigenous peoples in voluntary isolation. And the Human Rights Council earlier this year also affirmed the rights of indigenous peoples in voluntary isolations and their protections. So I know this is a lot of information, but just to say, on paragraph 25 of the Just Transition Work Program, there was also a decision to develop a new just transition mechanism. So this presents a new opportunity for indigenous peoples to influence this new mechanism. And because this is what the future architecture of just transition looks like. This is where this is going to be discussed. And so we will make our submissions and propose what this just transition mechanism should look like. It should have indigenous people's participation in the design of policies, in the decision-making of this just transition mechanism. It must embed our leadership. And more importantly, this should be a tool that is for implementation of rights, not only a technical tool. And that's why it needs to be directly connected with the global stocktake so that it could directly influence the decisions that are made by countries, because the global stocktake is the only accountability tool established by the Paris Agreement. And so it's no secret that countries removed references to mining in the Just Transition Work Program. We worked very hard with the indigenous movement and allied organizations to include references to the risks of mining in the document, in the Just Transition Work Program. But it's no secret, China pushed very hard to remove references to the risks of mining. And other countries that are mining dependent also pushed very hard to remove those references. So, but we will not give up. We will keep fighting hard in all the spaces to make sure that our issues related to mining are recognized and addressed. This is just an example. In Zambia, in February this year, there was a huge spill from a Chinese mining company that's extracting copper. And they are saying we are producing the copper for the energy transition, and we are producing the copper for AI technologies. But this can be very harmful to the environment. I don't have to read the quotes that you see there, but they hired an environmental assessment firm after the spill. And this is one of the risks, as you can see, very tangible risks. Because it's not just about the time of extraction, but after the mining is gone, 30, 40 years after they start extraction, there is also lots of waste that is left on the lands of indigenous peoples. So we are basically, this so-called energy transition is being built on the backs of indigenous peoples, on the backs of the territories that are highly biodiverse. Someone's going to pay this environmental cost. They are externalizing the cost onto indigenous peoples. And finally, just to quickly say, wherever there is foreign direct investment, there is violence. The Wharton School of Copenhagen did a study, and they said that where foreign direct investment and indigenous peoples overlap, there is an additional 6.7 conflicts the following year. So there were also some hopeful developments. Colombia banned all new oil and mining projects in its Amazon, which is wonderful. So we now need to make sure that they implement. And Brazil also said that they will be recognizing 10 indigenous peoples' lands, which also one of those lands overlaps with indigenous peoples' involuntary isolation and initial contact. Thank you so much, and I will stop there.
Thank you so much, Bryan, for all this throughout explanation and sharing information. Well, we've come to the end of the webinar. I fear we don't have enough time to answer all of your questions, but we are taking note of them, and we will provide the summary of the Q&As via email. So I know we have some pending things. And before we go, I would like to give the floor to WWF to provide some final thoughts, conclusions, and also it would be good, to answer one question: how to be part of the Alliance for a Just Energy Transformation, the AJET. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Maria. Maybe, Dean, I'll leave you a minute for the last question on how to become part of AJET, but just some final remarks, conscious also of time. I just wanted to thank again so very much every speaker today, Maria, Minnie, Whitner, Dean, and Bryan, for the excellent presentations and the very valuable messages. AJET and WWF looks forward to continue working on this topic to ensure a truly just and effective energy transition where Indigenous people are recognized as leaders. So again, thank you all very much for joining today the call. Thank you all very much for the participation. Maybe Dean, just one last minute regarding the AJET question. Thank you.
No, thanks very much, Sergio. I was struck by some of the things that were said actually in the launch, which are fairly critical, I think, to some of the issues we're trying to address as AJET. This whole idea about the ecosystem health being fundamental for the land management of Indigenous communities and how sort of energy, climate, and nature are all connected. Clearly, we've got to make everybody a lot more aware of the rights, the knowledge, the perspectives of Indigenous peoples. And I think Minnie was saying that the energy transition measures can't be based only on this idea of greater good and international development. It's clear that's not sufficient for a sustainable future. We have to fast track the renewable energy, but not at the expense of the Indigenous communities. And then there can be sort of private sector interests in that. Linking with Indigenous groups can have real value, real economic benefit. So we need to get the message across. But in short, we can't have a sustainable future without everybody being on board. So we've got to work in partnership if we're going to get lasting results. And Sergio, you mentioned previously, and Bryan as well, really reinforced this whole issue of critical minerals or transition minerals. Now, we must make it very clear that the damage from transition minerals is certainly going to be much less than anything from fossil fuel mining, extraction, production, etc. But we do need to manage this very carefully, and that's something that AJET is looking at, and very interested to hear from others who would like to be involved in that whole process. This issue about energy transition or energy addition that Bryan mentioned also is another critical issue. The rate of energy demand is increasing. Yes, we're having lots more renewables, but we can't keep up with this rate of demand. So we need energy efficiency, and we've got to carefully manage the greater increase of renewables. I like as well this idea of no-go zones. Is free and prior informed consent really sufficient? Something else we're looking at in terms of offshore renewable energy to protect marine life. So that's something else we can look at. But the main message, I think, from all of this is that this report is not the start, not the end of this process, it's the start. So we want to really try to include Indigenous peoples in this global energy transformation. Mina mentioned earlier, the report has highlighted some very top-level issues. So now we need to dig deeper to address those issues in a practical way. And that's the role of AJET. And really, to get involved, please simply, I could read out the web page address, but if you just Google AJET, so AJET and WWF, then that will take you to the web page. And there's an opportunity there just to sign up for any interest for involvement. So I'm sorry that was a bit longer than I expected at the end, but I'll leave it there. And thanks very much to everybody for raising all of these issues. Very, very useful session. So, and thanks to all for joining in as well.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Thank you to all the panelists. And we'll be sure to send the recording plus the Q&A that we have here, and hopefully most of the presentations that our panelists provided today. Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful day, and we'll be in touch.
Thank you.